Hello dear Motorsport-Magazin.com friends and Formula One fans. The China Grand Prix is just around the corner at the Shanghai International Circuit. It is back on the Formula One racing calendar and with it the first sprint of the season. In this video we explain what the new sprint format looks like, as there have been some changes. But we also take a look at the media day in China to see what has changed. But first of all, the sprint format. I know this sprint is not everyone's favorite, but to make it everyone's favorite, Formula One has made a few more changes that are not intended to create an even greater spectacle. No, changes to make the drivers feel a bit more comfortable and the hardcore fans too. There was a lot of discussion about the sprint format. Even reverse grids were once again under discussion, but that was quickly put to bed. This new format was found, but it was never really communicated. And that's exactly why we want to explain in a little more detail what the new weekend format looks like and what has changed within the regulations. Young history, the sprint is not such an old idea. Nevertheless, if I've counted correctly, it's already the third weekend format. First of all, we had a format in which the sprint also determined the starting grid for the Grand Prix. That no longer exists since last year. You had your own sprint qualifying, then the sprint, and then you had your own qualifying for the race. The only problem was that qualifying for the Grand Prix was already on Friday. Then you had the entire sprint on Saturday in between, so we had a really spectacular sprint day. And then you went into the race and had to remember what had actually happened on Friday. It was all a bit illogical, and that's why they said they'd reorganize it now. That's why there's a practice session on Friday, then it's on to the sprint qualifying. New old name, it was still called Sprint Shootout last year. So shootout was a funny word, we can erase it from our memories, we don't need it anymore. Sprint qualifying in the tried and tested format, 2 mediums, then the soft tires in Sprint Quali 1, Sprint Quali 2, Sprint Qualifying 3 and so on. Everything remains the same, but on Friday afternoon. Then we go into Saturday and it gets pretty exciting. We have the sprint in the morning, and then about 5.5 hours after the end of the sprint, we have qualifying for the Grand Prix. Of course, there are pros and cons. On the one hand, qualifying for the Grand Prix and the Grand Prix are now combined, which means you don't have to rethink things so much. On the other hand, people are concerned that you might not go flat out in the sprint because you want to take it easy on the car, because you want to take part in qualifying later. A break for repairs, 5.5 hours. Yes, you can do something about that, but you probably can't build up a whole car in that time. So there are a lot of pros and cons. I'm looking forward to seeing how things turn out on this first weekend. I'm also looking forward to the new Parc Fermé regulations. That was a big point of criticism from the pilots. At the previous format, because you had the first free practice session, then you went into qualifying, and then the setup for the rest of the weekend was more or less fixed. You couldn't change anything after just one practice session. That's why there are now 2 Parc Fermé. The first Parc Fermé starts at the beginning of sprint qualifying on Friday evening, when they go out for the first time, and then the setup is fixed, but only until the end of the sprint on Saturday morning. Then a new Parc Fermé begins with the start of qualifying, and that applies to qualifying and the Grand Prix. So that's quite interesting. We'll come back to that later. If you make a mistake early in the weekend, you can change it again, at least for qualifying and the race. Of course, this also means plank wear. That was a big issue last season, that you only had one session to determine the ground clearance and see if the wear was right. You can make further adjustments and be a bit more aggressive. At the same time, the new weekend format naturally also has an impact on the tire rules. We won't go into detail here. You can read about that on our website. In principle, however, there will still be 12 sets of tires on a sprint weekend. A big topic this weekend is, of course, the front-running Red Bull versus Ferrari. Ferrari's 1-2 victory in Melbourne was followed by disillusionment for the Formula One world in Suzuka, if you like. Red Bull's return to their old strength was a real slap in the face for everyone, but the China Shanghai International Circuit has completely different track characteristics again to Suzuka, and some people believe that Ferrari could return to their Melbourne form and really be a serious competitor for Red Bull. Charles Leclerc is more pessimistic. He says he thinks they are heading towards Suzuka performance relative to Red Bull Racing. There won't be any updates this weekend. It's a sprint weekend, so updates are always an issue, and that's why he's relatively pessimistic. Red Bull is at least a little bit scared. They're afraid of the track characteristics, yes, but Max Verstappen also said that he had a weak Friday in Melbourne where he had problems. On Saturday in free practice 3, you couldn't really sort out these problems either. Then, however, he believes that he made a breakthrough with the setup, but then couldn't show it in the race because he retired early. Sergio Perez, on the other hand, then had the problem with the tear-off visor in the race, which got caught in his car, so we don't really know how strong the Red Bull would have been in the race in Melbourne. But let's take a closer look at the track characteristics. Why do we say it's more like Melbourne? Melbourne is a street circuit, Shanghai is a permanent circuit. If you look at the layout, it's also completely different. Melbourne is now much faster thanks to the renovation work that was carried out there a few years ago, but the track is generally front limited and also causes a bit of graining. Graining, as we have learned, is a stumbling block for Red Bull last year in Las Vegas and this year in Melbourne. So that seems to be a small weak point and front limited, which means the front axle is the limiting factor. That was also the case in Melbourne, but then comes a very interesting point. Carlos Sainz interjected that China is not always a front limited circuit. There have been years when the rear axle was more of a problem, but then there have also been years when the front axle was the problem, and you have to find the right setup. You try to compensate for that with the setup, and then it gets exciting again with the Parc Fermé regulation. We have 2 Parc Fermés, so it's possible that if you get the setup right, you'll look good for the weekend. But then it's also possible that we'll see a complete spin between sprint qualifying and sprint, and then between the real qualifying and the Grand Prix. So there's an additional tension factor. If it goes well in the sprint and then in sprint qualifying, that doesn't mean that it will be the same in the race or vice versa, of course. That's a very interesting point. And whether an axle, the front axle or the rear axle will be the limiting factor now also depends very, very much on the asphalt. And we'll look at that in a moment. But first, let's take a look at our print edition. Issue number 95, Lewis Hamilton switches to Ferrari. You can still read all about this switch. If you're quick now, you'll still get the issue. Issue number 96 is already on its way to the mailboxes of some subscribers. The printers have informed us that there will be a slight delay, so bear with us if it takes a few more days before you receive the issue. Now you can still get issue 95 if you are not yet a subscriber, but you can also order issue number 96 for home delivery. abo.motorsport-magazin.com. Asphalt will be a decisive factor this weekend. I have announced it. Above all, whether it will be the front or rear axle that determines the track. This year, everyone is heading into the unknown in China, as we haven't been back since the coronavirus break in 2019. We had a long corona break, and there was a lot of confusion about what had actually been done to the track in the meantime. Is there now a completely new layer of asphalt? Some people have reported this. Pirelli knew nothing about it. They said, no, it hasn't been resurfaced. Now we've arrived in China. Some of the drivers have already done a track walk and said, wait a minute, this has been resurfaced. It looks completely new. We provide the clarification, no, it hasn't been resurfaced. The new asphalt will only be laid after the race weekend. That took a bit of time. They were late on the Chinese side. Yes, they have plenty of time now, but in the end, it's always like everywhere else. You have time, it passes, and then at some point, it's 5 to 12. Tenders still have to be launched and so on. So the complete resurfacing is only done after the Grand Prix for next year. But the track was not in perfect condition. That's why they really had to work on it. The bumps in particular were a huge question mark. You could already see the bumps at the last Formula One guest appearance in 2019, and the old generation of cars was still in use then. Now with the ground effect cars, bumps are a completely different issue. The problem is that you can't really see bumps very well. Sometimes you can't even measure them properly. For example, Bahrain start-finish just before the first corner. The cars touch down brutally there, but you can't actually see anything on the track. You can see where the cars touch down, but you can't see this bump. It's also very difficult to just measure. In China, however, you could already see a few bumps, especially turn 1 before turn 1 and turn 8. There are underpasses where the track settles. The track is built on marshland, and that's why there were bigger bumps, and also in turn 3. So something was removed to make these bumps less pronounced. In a night and fog operation, really under pouring continuous rain, they even did a bit of work on Thursday night because the heavy rain also caused some swelling and the track was therefore not in perfect condition. So the conditions were difficult. They tried to get it in the right condition for the Grand Prix so that the cars could drive on it. But what's with the drivers' statements that somehow everything looks so new that it has been resurfaced? Where did these rumors come from? The fact is that a few years ago in China they said, yes, we have to make sure that this asphalt stays in good condition somehow, and that's why they sealed the asphalt a bit. This was done with a layer of bitumen that was applied on top, so it's neither a coating nor a new asphalt layer, it's more of a sealant. However, experts doubt that this has really done any good. Nevertheless, there is now a layer of bitumen over it. When the areas were milled off, it looked rather strange, completely light-colored old asphalt, and then this dark bitumen layer. Then they said, okay, we'll seal these areas too. It also has the advantage that you can consolidate these somewhat loosened areas with this sealant. This also makes the area a little better. Nevertheless, there is now a fresh layer of bitumen over it. What does the whole thing mean for us in Formula One? If it stays dry, which is a big question mark, do you think that this bitumen layer will come off very, very, very quickly, that we will then see a very fast racing line? And in terms of grip, that shouldn't be a big problem. However, if it rains, the whole thing will be a bit more exciting. Then we might get a bit of a Turkey flashback. We drove there directly after the resurfacing, and then it rained, and then it was a very, very slippery affair. That's exactly what we fear now in Shanghai. The weather forecasts, yes, they are a bit mixed. It's difficult to really read anything into them. So asphalt remains a big issue, but you know it now, not newly asphalted, just sealed. So a bit of a packet sanded down and then sealed, but no new packet laid. Maybe that's a bit of a comparison. But there are other changes to the track, changes that I actually find quite interesting. Some of the asphalt runoff zones have been reduced a little and a gravel bed has been laid behind them in turns 10, 12 and 16. I find this particularly interesting in turn 16 because we often had a track limit problem there. The artificial turf was removed and the gravel bed was installed 1.70 meters behind the curb. That means with a vehicle width of 2 meters. Track limits shouldn't really be a problem. Let's hope so when the cars become a bit narrower again. Then there's also the curb. The white line is the track limit. So I hope that will be okay in future years. In years 2026, the cars will be 10 centimeters narrower. We don't want it to be like the Red Bull Ring, where we have a gravel bed. After a small asphalt strip and the cars right in between, we'll still have track limit problems. So let's hope so. As I said, the artificial turf has been completely removed, as have the sausage curbs. Of course, they've fallen out of favor a bit in the meantime, especially with the current generation of vehicles. So much for this page. Now let's take a look at your favorite topic, the driver market. There's been big news from Fernando Alonso in the last few days, and that was also a huge topic at the media day in Shanghai. Max Verstappen is seen as a bit of a key figure in the whole driver market poker that is about to take place. But now he says himself, I actually feel quite comfortable. We are now talking more about performance and so on. That's how it should be. So he doesn't necessarily give the impression at the moment that leaving Red Bull Racing early is still a big issue for him. Is this just the calm before the storm? At the moment, I would personally say that the whole situation at Red Bull is still very, very difficult to assess, also in terms of the power structure. And of course, the power structure also goes hand in hand with Max Verstappen and possibly Adrian Newey. Sergio Perez, the second Red Bull driver, has actually done quite well. He actually expects decisions on the driver market relatively soon, namely in the coming weeks. He says quite clearly that he is only 34 years old. He wants to carry on and still has a long career ahead of him. Fernando Alonso shows how it's done. Dr. Helmut Marko said some very interesting things to our colleagues from the Kleine Zeitung. He said that, of course, they are also talking to Carlos Sainz, but he has an offer from Audi with so much money that Red Bull can't match it. So being able to, I think that's more a question of wanting to. But what about Carlos Sainz? He's a bit like the hottest bachelor on the market. If you take away Max Verstappen, who is in the form of his life, then Charles Leclerc is often overshadowed at the moment. He believes it will take a while before a decision is made. Of course, he would like to have it sooner, then he just get rid of it in his head. But at the same time, he says it's not all his decision how the whole thing turns out. Now you could say that the Fernando Alonso extension was bad news for him. He himself says that the good news is that his best options are still there. In other words, he definitely doesn't count Aston Martin as one of his best options. Are they Mercedes then? Are they Red Bull Racing? He didn't want to let us look at his cards. He just repeated what he has said before, namely that he is talking to all the teams. Meanwhile, Mercedes tested Andrea Kimi Antonelli at the Red Bull Ring in the 2021 car. 2 days of private testing for him. Unfortunately, we didn't get any times. We would have liked to go there too, but unfortunately, we weren't allowed to watch. Yes, driver market, that could drag on a bit longer. What shouldn't drag on is your application, because we are looking for reinforcements for our editorial team here in Graz. We also offer a 6-month internship if you don't have much experience or want to see if it's the right thing for you. But as I said, only here at our location in Graz. All information about this can be found at jobs.motorsport-magazin.com. And now we are looking forward to a really exciting first sprint weekend, especially on a track that is back on the racing calendar after a much too long break. In my opinion, a great racetrack and lots of unknowns. Hopefully it will be a really good race weekend.